Hey there, I'm Christopher Dorobek, the Dorobek Insider, and welcome to GovLoop's Dorobek Insider, where we focus on 6 words helping government do its job better. A special edition of GovLoop's Dorobek Insider today. We are live. We do this each month in an effort to bring smart people together and share ideas because, yes, we believe that the real power of information comes when it's shared. We're going to do that today. Today we're talking about IT modernization. It's one of the big topics, really a key focus of the Obama administration's IT leadership and so many government CIOs. We hear them talk about it a lot. We have a great group of folks to talk about what IT modernization is and how you get it done. People who have been out there doing it and working on these issues. I'll quickly introduce them first. David Bray, he's the Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission. Lisa Schlosser, she just retired a couple months ago, formerly Deputy Federal CIO, and she just won a Fed 100, so congratulations, Lisa. Chad Sheridan, CIO of the Agriculture Department's Risk Management Agency. Before we get into the discussion, a few business items. GovLoop's Dorobek Insider Live is brought to you by MuleSoft, by Citrix, DLT, by Red Hat, by SolarWinds, and by TinTree. And this is GovLoop. That means we'd love to hear from you to make sure that we're addressing the topics that matter and helping you do your job better. If you're joining us live, you can submit questions and comments as we move forward. We will address as many of those as we can. We will also be busy taking notes throughout the program, and we will have a post pulled from this discussion. It will be posted on GovLoop's Dorobek Insider. I would also note that if you registered, we will email you a link to the on-demand version of this discussion, and you can hear any part of this again, share it with other people, laugh at any good jokes that I make, whatever. You'll have it. You can do with it as you please. And finally, if you have any problems as we move forward, just click on the Help button. One of our GovLoopians will be there to help you out. With all that, let's get right into this. As I mentioned, IT modernization, a big priority of the Obama administration, and Tony Scott, the most recent federal CIO, the administration were adamant proponents of the Modernizing Government Technology Act, which passed the House, but then got stalled in the Senate. That bill would have created a $3.1 billion working capital fund, both at the General Services Administration and at individual agencies, and interested groups could apply for those funds for specific technology projects. In our time together, we're going to talk about why IT modernization matters, the need for additional funding. But we're also going to talk about how agencies are getting modernization done if they don't have that additional funding. We're going to talk about how you manage people during the modernization process. Yes, I know people can be an issue too. How you manage the process, how you manage the technology, a lot to get to. And I'm sure we're going to run out of time, so let me stop talking and let's get busy. Before I bring in our guests, let's get a bit of an overview. GovLoop recently published our most recent guide. This is the GovLoop guide, if you will. It's headlined, Your Roadmap to IT Modernization. You have access to it right from your console here. I've also tweeted out a link to it, to the guide. It's on my Twitter feed, @CDorobek or @DorobekInsider, so you can find that nice and easily. The author of that guide is GovLoop's Francesca Elatrush. And Francesca, walk us through the guide a little bit. What were some of the big findings? There's some great case studies in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chris. And just as you were saying, the real thing it boils down to is modernization for government is just a must. It's important for security and efficiency, and it's important for helping government employees to do their jobs better while delivering better services to the American public. So our guide is really about helping government to address the challenges facing agencies, like maintaining legacy IT systems and moving from those. But it's not just that. There's also a lot of confusion as to what IT modernization actually looks like. Is it the same for every agency? Is it even achievable with shrinking budgets and all the changes that come with a new administration? So in our latest guide, Your Roadmap to IT Modernization, we provide some guidance that any government employee, whether in IT or not, can use to help get a better picture of what their agency's modernization journey should look like. It's kind of a 5-play roadmap based on a recent report by the American Council for Technology Industry Advisory Council, or ACT-IAC. And we cover the IT modernization lifecycle, which takes you from drawing a roadmap of what you want your IT modernization project to achieve to the deployment and execution stages, and even what to do post-modernization to maintain the success of your agency's modernization efforts. We also give an overview of some important pieces of legislation floating around in the IT modernization circle, kind of like you touched on earlier, that that IT modernization fund, the $3.1 billion Kickstart fund that's kind of being stalled now, but we discussed some of those and kind of what they would mean for government. So with all these resources, steps, and stages, it also really helps to start by understanding what modernization means in the first place. IT modernization has been defined as the continuous evolution of an organization's existing application and infrastructure software. And the ultimate goal is for to align IT with ever-shifting organizational missions and strategies. So the key thing to take away from that is that IT modernization should be continuous and ever-evolving, right? It also means that every agency is going to have different goals and therefore unique modernization needs. So there's really no one-size-fits-all approach here. We provide a few case studies in the guide, and one example is the state of Illinois' modernization project. Their project needs centered on consolidating all of their information technologies and tools into one place. And so to achieve its goal of IT consolidation, the state rolled out the Department of Innovation and Technology, or DO-IT, a new agency that brought the entire state's IT portfolio under one umbrella. So the modernization project consolidated 38 IT silos into one agency, brought together 1,700 employees, and improved the management of their nearly $1 billion portfolio of IT investments. Additionally, this helped the state of Illinois provide better high-value customer service to their citizens with a coordinated service center and more customer-centric technology. So that's just one example of what an IT modernization project can look like in an agency. But the most important thing to take away from this guide is that every agency's modernization needs and priorities will be different. So for every agency, we just advise that they spend plenty of time in the planning phase to really identify what legacy systems they need to keep, what they can replace, what they can migrate from, and where they want to innovate. So I'm really looking forward to hearing today from our other guests about their advice to approaching IT modernization.
Awesome. Thanks, Fran. Much appreciated. Again, the guide is available for you both on your console. I've also tweeted it out, either see Dorobek or at DorobekInsider, so you can get it nice and easily. Let me reintroduce our guest, David Bray, Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission. Lisa Schlosser, she is former Deputy Federal CIO and a Fed 100 winner this year. Congratulations, Lisa. And Chad Sheridan, CIO at the Agriculture Department's Risk Management Agency. I wanted to stop, and Fran mentioned it a little bit, and I'll start with you, Lisa. The need for this. Why is this important? Why is this something that I've heard all sorts of CIOs talk about? Why does modernization matter?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me onto the show here. And I would put a plug in for the guide that Francesca mentioned, and commend GovLoop as well for that guide. I think it's one of the most comprehensive, practical approaches to modernization that quite frankly, I've seen. So I just encourage everyone to take a minute and look through that. So, Chris, to answer your question, why is this important? Why is it essential? You know, I think first I want to start with saying I want to underscore something Francesca said, and that's the fact that this is a journey. It's a continuous and evolving process to modernize, you know, our infrastructures. But the bottom, regardless of it being a journey or not, we cannot continue the current status quo in the way that we buy, build, and deliver technology. I mean, just a couple of stats. There's at least 6 systems that I just kind of know of. They're over 50 years old, supporting core business functions or services in the government. There's many more that are in the 20 to 30-year range. Approximately 75% of the federal IT budget is spent on just maintaining these and other antiquated systems. You know, most of the time we're just putting a pretty front end on very complicated back end systems, and we just can't continue to sustain that. I've also seen cases where 30% of an infrastructure in at least one agency that I am aware of was end of life. I mean, not even supported by the vendor. So why is this important that we tackle this? Number one, you know, because these legacy systems are based on these outdated technologies and are still very complex on the back end, it's very difficult to change, and agencies are finding it difficult to respond to market, regulatory, and customer required shifts. Number two, maintaining these legacy systems. The costs are continuing to escalate for licensing purposes, maintaining multiple systems, and for paying for a very limited supply of skill sets that have the ability to manage these systems. And finally, probably for me as somebody who really is passionate about cybersecurity and paying attention to that, when you have core infrastructure components and apps that are end of life and aren't supported, they can't be secured. That's the reason we have to really double down and pay attention on IT modernization.
I love that. And so many of these parts that we want to break down, but let me bring in David Bray, CIO at FCC. David, you heard what Lisa said. Why does IT modernization matter?
So IT modernization matters just because, as you and I guess we all know, that technology is not steady state. In fact, the consumer space is expected to replace their phones about every 2 years or so. And I would venture that probably we in public service, we do not replace our IT systems every 2 years. And that's partly because we need to be good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, but at the same time, having experienced sequestration earlier this decade and then followed by the do more with less strategy, unfortunately for a lot of organizations in public service, that equated to do no new IT and just basically maintain yourself on your legacy systems. And as Lisa mentioned, there is a GAO report that says on average, organizations are spending upwards of 75 to 80% of their budgets just to maintain the legacy systems they have. That was actually the experience I had when I arrived at the FCC. When I arrived in 2013, in August of 2013, we were spending 85% or more of our budget just to maintain 207 different IT systems with an average age of more than 10 years old. And that's just not scalable. On a flat budget, we've not seen a budget increase. You have to basically get out of that trap. And so for us, we made a very intentional push for IT modernization to reduce the amount of money that we were spending on legacy systems. And sure enough, in less than 2 years, we went to 100% public cloud and commercial service provider. And in the process, reduced our spend from being 85% to maintain our systems to being less than 50%. So that means we could actually reinvest the savings in doing new IT as opposed to just trying to maintain old IT. And even more importantly, instead of spending 6 or 7 months to stand up a new IT system, now when you come to us with new requirements, we can get you a working prototype in less than 48 hours. So it's accelerating the delivery of solutions that is a much faster clip than what public service has done in the past. And finally, if you think about it, if your IT is probably more than 7 or 8 years old, that also means it's not up to date in terms of the security that's necessary, the patches that are necessary, the things that are required to basically just survive in the modern cyber threat environment. And so I would submit the other reason why one needs to do IT modernization, aside from being a more effective steward of the taxpayers' dollars and being a more effective delivering of solutions with speed, is you also just have to recognize that cyber threats never stop. If we don't get off old IT, that itself is a risk.
When in fact I was in prep for this, I was reading the GAO report that you mentioned, and their top line is the federal government spent more than 75% of the total amount budgeted for IT in fiscal 2015 on operations and maintenance investments. I mean, that just feels, you know, we always talk about government being innovative. How can you possibly be innovative when you're spending not only half, 75% of your money on old stuff, right?
Yep. And in a private sector context, you would simply go to your CEO and your board of directors, you need to make the value proposition. They would find funds to take the short-term hit of you've got to invest money to get out of spending money, and you'd be able to do that. I think the challenge we have is in so many cases, one, the value proposition is not necessarily perceived because, let's face it, there is all downside if something doesn't go right. There is very little reward. You're not going to have a IPO or a bonus. And the other challenge is, I'll be honest, is actually I think the thing I observed in leading FCC to get out of legacy IT and go and embrace cloud computing is there are certain, I have to be cautious as I say, there are certain incumbent contractors that are currently profiting off the legacy IT systems. And so you are eating into certain revenue models that, quite frankly, while not in the best interest of the public, will provide resistance to trying to get out of these legacy systems because they will not make as much money when you are leaner and you're more effective. But that's clearly what we have to do as members of the public service, is get off those legacy systems, despite the incumbents feeling like that may be threatening their revenue model.
Yeah. Chad, I'm going to bring you in a second, but Maria and a couple other people have asked the name of the guide. The name of the guide is your roadmap to IT modernization, and you can find it right there on your console. But you can also, I tweeted it out both at Dorobek and DorobekInsider if you want to find it. If you can't find it on your console and you're having problems, it's there as well. And I think we send it out. When we send out the follow-up, the on-demand version, we'll send you a link to that as well. But let me bring in Chad Sheridan. As I mentioned, he's the CIO for the Agriculture Department's Risk Management Agency. Chad, there are probably people who don't know what the everyone knows what FCC is, everyone knows what OMB is, but not everybody knows what the Risk Management Agency is. So give me the little elevator pitch on what you do.
The elevator pitch is simple. We provide and run, partnered with private industry, the federal crop insurance program. About 1.1 million policies per year, ensuring a total value of about $100 billion every year. So farms stay in business because they purchase crop insurance, and unlike the subsidy programs that many people like to rail about, the best part about crop insurance is that it's an informed decision where the producer or the program participant has a stake in the game. They actually pay premium to participate in the program, so they're making a true decision and not just having their hand out. I think the other thing is the speed of delivery. You don't have to wait for an act of Congress to get relief when a disaster strikes. It's usually about a month from, if you have a claim, the farmer will get paid in about a month.
Awesome. So talk about IT modernization. How does IT modernization, what does it mean to the Risk Management Agency?
It's existential in two ways. One, I talked about the idea that crop insurance is very responsive. It's also a program that is complex and ever-changing. So if we don't have systems that can handle changes that come from grower groups or changes that come with the new Farm Bill, which is, I think tomorrow the Senate Ag Committee is having their first public sessions around the next Farm Bill. Seems like we just did it. If we can't implement those changes quickly, and quickly means we want them yesterday after the legislation was passed. So if our systems can't support that, we lose credibility, and for our program, credibility with the growers and the industry is everything. The other part of existential is David touched on, and Lisa touched on, the idea that old systems that are no longer supported are an inherent security risk. Well, to put it in business terms, why I say it's existential is that producers, farmers, rural America does not like giving the government its information, and it's required to give your personally identifiable information to participate in the program. If we were to have a breach because we were unable to modernize, then people would not participate. And the whole basis for federal crop insurance is a broad base of risk established across the entire country so that a flood in one state will not fundamentally overturn the program. If we lose participation, our program is no longer viable and we go out of existence. And if the 2012 drought happens again, the number of farms in the U.S. has stabilized about mid-80s, and that was just after the program moved from an entirely public program to a public-private partnership. I don't want to say that crop insurance was the only thing that caused that decline in the number of farms in the U.S. to stop, but it's an essential part of the ability for farmers to stay in business.
And as you and Lisa, both Lisa and David mentioned, the attempts, everyone's, you have to be as good as, have new apps, have new things that are out there. And what I hear from CIOs that I talk to are, it's really hard to do that with the old clunky systems that we have in place right now. Chad, that was still to you. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two pieces to that. One, the mindset of how you develop. is a huge part of that, and that's actually something we took on first. We could argue it was chicken and egg. We found that in trying to move to more agile, to smaller projects, to shorter delivery, we came to a point at which if we didn't modernize a portion of our infrastructure, it didn't matter that we would go to configured versus custom-built apps. It didn't matter that we were delivering applications. At some point, if I don't have an infrastructure to put those on quickly that has similarities and is resilient and can withstand increased load or varying loads, I'm only attacking part of the puzzle. We had to go attack both sides of the equation.
Lisa, at OMB, you got to see this from so many different angles and so many different sides. What is the biggest challenge to being able to actually modernize the federal agencies' IT, the infrastructure? What's the biggest challenge there?
I'll probably just touch on 5 because I think they're all challenges very quickly, though. First of all, it's overriding. You have to break down really a culture that's existed for 40, 50 years in the way that, back to what Chad was saying, and David touched on it as well, in the way we buy and build and deliver technology and deploy technology. We're used to these, still within many agencies, these, projects that take years and years. And so the first thing is really getting the whole culture. The first challenge is really getting the culture wrapped around and supportive of this more agile, this agile type of approach. 48 hours turnaround to meet a business requirement that David mentioned. That's like amazing, but that's what we have to do. But to get there and change that culture, you have to have the technology leaders who know the right questions to ask. This is the really practical thing I want to share here because I learned a lot when I was at OPM for 6 months recently as a CIO. But the tech leaders at all levels have to understand what's in your environment, how old everything is in your environment, what's connected where your data is, what your architecture looks like. And something we don't talk about a lot because it's so tactical, but just kind of understanding all the licensing you have in place with all the different vendors that know way more about the product and where it's deployed than probably most people in your organization. So challenge 1. Secondly, is really understanding how to take that information and put it into a cohesive, business plan and or roadmap, I guess, to show how you're going to undertake this journey. And another practical point, what we don't do very well is say what we're going to shut down in addition to what we're going to build. And I think being more transparent in that roadmap as to what you're going to decommission and show the cost avoidance for decommissioning, against how you're going to modernize is important. You have to make tough decisions that aren't going to be popular. Business leaders don't always get involved. I think that's a challenge in the DevOps process overall, and they have to be intimately involved. And then probably the other challenge is just kind of keeping the business leaders engaged and on board. And so that's being uber sensitive to being transparent, continuously good or bad with your entire organization.
I don't want to just go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to go to Chad, and I'll bring you in a second, David. But Chad, do those ring true to the challenges you face?
I think that's a part of it. The one I would add to that is to make this work, and Lisa mentioned the idea of how do you get your business leads involved. We got to stop talking about IT as we try to get those business leads involved. We have to start talking about what the value is to the business proposition. So, every time I hear anybody on my team mention that something's an IT project, if they try to tell me that the modernization effort we're undertaking is an IT project, they know that, CIO smash, we're not going to do that. It's a business project. It's an agency project because we have to be able to point it back to the value it provides. It either reduces the program risk or it enhances the resiliency of the network or improves, so we have to have business metrics associated with everything we do, because the danger we run into is if you can't put it in mission terms, then it's very easy for either new political leadership or existing business leadership to go, yeah, but I'd like my shiny. Give me my shiny. All this infrastructure, nobody cares, right? Nobody cares about IT until it doesn't work. So we've got to be able to put it in terms that the entire agency can understand.
I have a 5-year-old, so every time somebody mentions shiny, I'm in Moana, and because that song runs on an endless loop in our house. But David, I was actually reading a story yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about Ticketmaster, and it's moving its infrastructure to the cloud. And I'll quote them. Part of their challenge was they just weren't able to keep up with the amount of incoming requests, and traffic spiked 647% on the day after they moved to the cloud infrastructure. It just enabled them to do things that they weren't. And I'm not talking cloud or not cloud, but they said we just couldn't handle the infrastructure. How much it feels a little bit like that is a challenge that the government faces as well, is, hey, we're just not able to keep up with our current infrastructure just isn't able to keep up. What are the challenges implicit in there?
Sure. So I was going to say, if you look at what happened with the Dyn attacks about now it's upwards of 3 months ago, that was a case in which it wasn't just public service infrastructure; it was both public sector and private sector infrastructure was dependent on a service that, when a denial of service attack was launched on that had far-reaching implications for other private sector companies that just couldn't provide their services as a result. And with public sector, we have both denial of service attacks that are intentional, but we also have, when there's a very intense issue that gets a lot of press, that can trigger also people sort of rushing and both trying to fill the queue, as well as maybe to try and find ways to sort of circumvent the queue and or make it difficult for people to access those services. And if you're doing that on premise with your own infrastructure, then you are left to having to figure out how you spin up more servers, how you spin up more infrastructure. And in some respects, you're literally talking about going out with a government credit card and trying to buy things on the fly, which is really not a way to operate an organization. And so what cloud gets for you is, if that surge happens, whether because there's now intense human interest, whether because it's now an intentional denial of service attack or something else, you can now begin to respond to it virtually, as opposed to literally having to stand up new hardware, new software as the demand occurs. And like you said with the Ticketmaster example, that's a wonderful example of why you would not want to do things on premise. The other thing that I sort of want to build on what both Chad and Lisa were saying, I feel it's been rather unfortunate that over the last 3 years, we had in public service a very heavy fixation about writing code from scratch. And maybe that was a response to a feeling like, for whatever reason, the 1 or 2 year monolithic waterfall model was not working for us, and therefore we will do Agile, and we'll do Agile all by ourselves. And I would highly discourage that we don't look at that going forward. I can't imagine in World War II the U.S. government saying, we're going to build all these airplanes for the war ourselves. Instead, actually, we need to think about how do we partner with the private sector. And really the value of cloud comes from recognizing that with software as a service, I would submit that 95% of what we do in public service, you can find an available software as a service offering, and maybe it's an offering of where you pair together 2 or 3 to get the final product that meets what we need without us having to write it from scratch, that can get us quicker delivery. And I think that is a new model for us to think about, and it actually raises the question about how can we procure it faster so that each agency is not trying to do the procurement themselves? How can we have responsibility for the security so that it's not being done by each agency, but maybe if something is FedRAMPed, it is then reusable across all of federal space, as opposed to each agency having to do the control. I really think this is the chance that we can actually think about not just the overall enterprise of agencies, but the overall enterprise of public service, and begin to ask the question about how can we best, one, give CIOs, give mission owners in their different contexts the autonomy to do what they need, but do it in a context that makes the best sense, so that we're not reinventing the wheel 100 different times.
Either Chad or Lisa, somebody's breathing, so I hesitate to say don't breathe, but at least don't breathe into the microphone. Yeah, Lisa, go ahead.
I just okay. It's gonna be hard to talk without breathing, but let me see if I
I
can
know,
give it a
I
shot.
know.
I just want to totally underscore what David just said there. We really have to take advantage of some of the expertise in the private sector, particularly. I've seen the cloud providers, the Amazons, et cetera, and Microsoft really mature very quickly in not just providing the services, but being really solid partners with the government in guiding us through how to optimize the use of the cloud and to help get you their playbooks or have gotten very sophisticated, very well done. So not just at the code level, but also, as you're putting together roadmaps and thinking through kind of how you want to move to the cloud, engaging with those providers, I think is really critical as well.
But
yeah, go Chad.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think that also requires a little bit of different mindset from a CIO shop because we're going to have to get the business to be able to use and configure a software as a service offering. We're going to have to get out of this. I want it exactly the way I want it, and the tendency of ourselves and our people to, oh, sure, we can do that. And a lot of the things that that are dragging us down this chain around our neck of legacy systems were that endless customization. That requires a mindset and a persuasion set, to be able to convince people that maybe you need to also look at your business process so that your business process is more able to work within configured software as a service as opposed to, well, I want it custom made to exactly the way I did it for the last 25 years.
Yes, and to underscore what Chad was saying, I mean, we've lived this at the FCC, and we continue that in some respects, when you move off of legacy IT, the technology is really only 20% of the issue. Yes, you also have to address the people issue and win hearts and minds to do it. However, also it really is rethinking how you do the business process, how you deliver results. And it can oftentimes be between doing something that you've been doing the same way for the last 20 or 30 years and recognizing that's going to cost you $1.5 million because it's customization, or maybe there's an opportunity to do something that's simpler or do something that comes out of the box with a software as a service offering, and instead of $1.5 million, it's only $50,000. And so that's where you really have to have the conversation both with the mission set, but also ultimately with the head of the organization, and that CIOs need to be able to go to the head of the organization and say, look, if you want to do the same process that we've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, yes, there's no change for the end user, but it's going to cost $1.5 million, or maybe here's actually something where instead of actually requiring you to fill out 18 different forms, we can almost do the equivalent of like TurboTax for data, where it actually says, what is the nature of your problem, and it actually asks for data only relevant to what you specifically need. And on top of it, instead of being $1.5 million, we can get that to you for $50,000. And that is something that is new, that CIOs aren't necessarily used to having that conversation with both the mission owners as well as the head of the organization, but really it is the process of true transformation that says maybe we can make things simpler for the citizens, maybe we can make things simpler for the organization, and as a net result, be much more effective with the limited taxpayer dollars that we have.
And David, as you say, you've actually done this. How did you have that conversation with the head of the organization that they understood it? Because that feels like a unique skill and a skill set that probably most CIOs need to have, right?
Yes. So I think it really is just laying out the business proposition and say, choice A is you change nothing about how you're currently doing things, and it's going to cost X, maybe $1.5 million. Choice B, you do some change, but you don't change it as much as you would want, but it's less resistance from the stakeholders, and maybe it's instead of $1.5 million, maybe it's $125,000. Or you can take this all change, you get these added features, and it's only $50,000. So you want to have that conversation with the head of the organization with the bureau or office that's involved present. And I agree 100% with what Chad said. There are no IT projects. There are simply mission or business projects that have IT baked into them. I think that is so key. But you also need to not just have a conversation within the organization, because at the end of the day, you do serve stakeholders in the public or with the private sector. And so bring them in. When we did our FCC.gov website, What had happened back in 2010 and 2011 is they had brought in some folks from Silicon Valley that were very well-intentioned about making the website Web 2.0 friendly, but they hadn't talked to the existing stakeholders, so that when they rolled out the redesign, the stakeholders were like, wait, I can't find a search box. You changed how I'm actually clicking on things. This is very unfamiliar, and they were very unhappy. And so when you begin to move people's cheeses, and let's be honest, modernization is moving people's cheeses on multiple levels. It's moving people's cheese as to where the boxes, the servers are located. You no longer care about that when you go to the cloud. It's moving how things are done in an organization. You may no longer need 10 people to do something. You only need one. So you actually need to help with retraining and actually help people see that there is a future, even if it's not doing what you used to do. And then finally, it is moving how you deliver results and the processes associated with that. And that's where you really have to have not just a conversation within your organization, but reach out to the public, reach out to stakeholders, and bring them in and say, look, we have different choices. What would make your life easier? And maybe if we choose to go this path, here's the value of it, and here's how much it would cost, versus if we go this path, it'll take take a longer time, but involve them because it really is a shared partnership, and that's why I think it's public service in terms of government providing solutions with both the private sector and the public involved in the process.
And Lisa, I'm going to bring you in because Jim asked a similar kind of question. He says, who's leading the IT modernization within the agency? Is it just the CIO IT lead, or is it the strategic project sponsored at the secretary, deputy secretary with input from business leaders? Did you see experience on how this works best? Is there a model that works better than others?
Yeah, I think a couple things. So first of all, I do want to address David's point about that transformation and even the subset modernization is definitely moving people's cheeses. I like that. I actually think we have to think differently about kind of chief information officers overall within agencies. I think FITARA was a good first step. But where I've seen this be successful in both my private sector experience and across the government is where you have your head of technology, your CIO, whatever you call it in the agency, at a level that's equal to your business leader, so a assistant secretary level, where the CIO is not under a secretary or assistant secretary of administration, where they're equal standing with the business leaders. I think that's number one. I'd also advocate for something like a 5-year term appointment for federal CIOs. Again, watching kind of after 5 years at OMB, really CIOs tend to stay in these roles maybe 2.5 years. And so you barely get things up and running, change the culture, and then you're being moved out, or you voluntarily move out. So I think we have to really think about that differently in that role and take it maybe even a little bit further than FITARA. But to answer your question directly, that's just a broad strategic comment I have that I'd encourage folks to think about that, because you don't make people happy in those first few years. You make people very unhappy. No matter how much you coordinate, collaborate. No matter how much you coordinate, collaborate, et cetera, kind of the first stages of transformation, bringing in these new ways of doing business, make people uncomfortable. So that does happen. But where it's actually I've seen it successful is when there is kind of a joint accountability where the CIO actually establishes a strong partnership with a champion of change who's well respected from within the business leadership community within the agency, and they jointly work on a project, show some kind of short-term successes, and then that helps to kind of build a longer-term support for the overall roadmap. So that's where I've seen it work most successfully.
I would also sorry, I was going to actually build on what Lisa was saying and recommend that we also need to think about. Generally, CIOs are not recruited for organizational empathy. And I think while that is not necessarily the first thing that they should have, I definitely think it's increasingly a skill set when you do have either limited funds or you have a hiring freeze and you can't hire additional people, that if you come in without a willingness and a desire to understand the narrative and the existing context that preceded you, when I arrived at the FCC, there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, and it wasn't because they weren't talented and they weren't skilled. It was just if you don't take the time to understand the organizational, I say narratives, but maybe another word would be pathologies present, that is death for you as a leader, and it possibly is also death for your team because now you've got change fatigue and you actually missed an opportunity to positively move things forward. And so I think there is a risk that a lot of organizations right now look at their CIOs and they think the I in CIO stands for Chief Infrastructure Officer, and they only expect them to do tech. And I would say if you as a CIO are doing probably more than half, maybe even more than 1/3 of your job focusing on tech and not people and how you change how the business operates, then you are doing a disservice to your organization. You really are just the head of enterprise operations or IT operations. But really what we need to think about is whether we still call it a CIO or something else, that really what the CIO is there for is to make sure that the organization stays relevant in a rapidly changing world that happens to involve tech change, that happens to involve how people and processes change, and most importantly, how the organization delivers results. And that, again, I do have to ask, with all the other burdens of that we've got FISMA requirements, we've got audit requirements, we've got other things that are placed on the CIO's lap, how can, and this is just an open question, how can Congress, how can the administration provide the incentives for people that really do want to save the public taxpayer dollars and recognize that it's risky and that it is not just a tech issue, it is actually fundamentally changing how people operate? What are the incentives to reward the behavior and the outcomes that they want to see occur? Of course, now there's silence.
There's a 25,000.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Look, you brought the conversation to halt. Thanks for your help, David. Really appreciate that.
My
well,
caution
it's
there.
worth asking.
My
I
caution
think
is that
go ahead, Chad.
is I'm always leery. No offense intended to my friends on the Hill. I'm always leery when I'm getting incentives from a 535 member body that many of whom do not have a 5-year longevity or a 5-year clock. I would almost say is 5 years enough. But I came from an organization where the appointed head was there for 8 years, and we called him a short timer. So I would say it would be more advantageous to those incentives need to have some operating envelope, some wiggle room, right? Because driving organizational change requires enough rope to hang ourselves. For those who are willing to take the risk to have enough freedom to make that organizational change, to take some risks, to work on the people side of change, to partner with a business champion. If we have more and more restrictive requirements or compliance mandates and that freedom goes down, now we're, if our hands are tied, we can't make modernization work.
Agreed. And I think that is key, is that is one is make sure you give autonomy, but also give autonomy with accountability. So you have freedom to operate, but you also have to be held accountable. The other thing, though, is I see very rarely highlighting what works and recognizing there are pockets of things that work, that are working across public service, that if that was highlighted, that I think in some respects that would motivate peer pressure amongst other agencies to try and do the same, and they'd actually see it's possible. I think if you only, unfortunately, spotlight the things that are going wrong, and you need to do that because that actually helps improve the system too, you demonstrate to people there's all that you will have the negative spotlight put on you if things don't go well, and there's actually no upside if you do things that are right. And I recognize there's not going to be an IPO in public service. That's not why we're here. But I do think the question is where are the successful modernization moving to the cloud? Because when we talk about like trying to address machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things, we can't even begin to do that until public service does move to modernization and cloud computing. That it needs to be sort of what things are working, almost like a venture capitalist model, and recognizing that it will be context dependent, that what one agency did is not what another agency can do. But if you're not even beginning to recognize those things that you want to have moving forward, then you're not going to have that progress at the speed and the acceleration that we need to have to succeed.
We could talk about change management, and I think this has been a great conversation. I want to talk a little bit about technology itself because, Lisa, so often when we talk about IT infrastructure, and even the Ticketmaster example, they talked about going to the cloud. Is that really what, and in fact, there have been a bunch of questions. I can give names here. Hold on. Gil and a couple other people asked the question about, are we just talking cloud here, or is IT modernization about something broader than that?
It's definitely about something broader than that, and I think that's a lesson learned from, our approach to our cloud-first policy from back in, 2009, 2010. The guide that we talked about at the beginning of this session really lays this out well, but it's more about, I think David mentioned this, or Chad, that really it's 20% about the technology, and the remainder is about kind of getting the people on board, getting your processes in place, first and foremost, understanding your business imperatives and priorities. So, I think it's really about understanding your business priorities, and then, and then within your CIO or IT organization, you have to understand your architecture, and using tools like, I know this is very technical, but this is part of the job as CIOs. You have to go from understanding business priorities and finances and investment strategies all the way to understanding what's end of life and what your licensing contracts look like in your organization, et cetera. And then you really do have to work with your business partners and conduct an application migration assessment, as well as an infrastructure assessment, and really look for that low-hanging fruit for application migration. And there's no simple technology or tool that helps you do that. Although I have seen, cloud providers where you do choose to move an app to the cloud. That may not be all your apps. You may choose to have a hybrid environment. But I have seen where there are tools provided that do help you migrate your data or re-platform your systems or rehost your systems in the cloud. But that's just one option you can take. Again, just to summarize that, you have to understand it's not just technology, it's about your business priorities and imperatives. And once you do kind of decide what your strategy is, what you do want to move for the right business reasons to the cloud or not move to the cloud, then, kind of communicating that. And then you start to think about kind of the tools on how you're going to make those moves.
Chad, I'm going to pull from two questions that people have submitted about this topic. One is from Greg, who says, is cloud a given for most agencies? Asked another way, why would agencies not go to the cloud, exception being security, if security in the cloud is a major issue? The other question is from Jim. He says, software as a service, cloud services provide great value, speed, agility. Sometimes the government's culture is also about business process. These needs need to be flexibility to partner and relook at the business process that reduces customizations. And kind of following up what David was talking about earlier, is this cloud, or is this? I mean, so often when people talk about IT modernization, they do talk cloud, but it feels broader than that to me.
It is broader than that, but I think that's where important fundamental statements need to be made by a CIO or by the leadership. Like, our intention is to, as much as we possibly can, move to customized software as a service. Or in our cases, we're modernizing. Our intention is to get out of the hosting business, to move to an off-site provider and or the cloud. So you may make some tactical decisions because maybe your application portfolio can't immediately be hosted in a cloud service. It's not ready, or the cost is too great immediately. But you need to recognize, or the team needs to recognize those intents. We used to call them commander's intent when I was in the Navy, right? The idea that this is where we intend to go, and what I tell my team, I intend to move our entire workload to the cloud, right? That's our intention. We may not get there immediately, but as we make decisions, and it's not cloud right away, okay, we understand that's why, and it's a stepping stone. Same thing with how you want to take your portfolio to less custom code and more configured as a service type application. Same thing. We need to broadcast over and over and over again what the intention is, and I can't let one of the things you said go. I mean, security in the cloud. Go visit a cloud provider. Go visit as a surprise your own data center and tell me which one looks like it's likely to be secure. I know what my answer is.
Totally agree with that. This is Lisa again. I was going to point that out. Thank you for doing that. Absolutely, positively agree with that comment about security in the cloud.
And sometimes it's always felt to me it's a little bit of apples and oranges comparison when we talk about security in the cloud, and where we talk about perfection of cloud. It gets a little crazy to me, but I get it. It's a very important topic. David, I wanted to bring you.
We still have to do our monitoring job there, Chris. I mean, just because we went to the cloud doesn't mean that all of our equities don't have to still be there. But the idea that we can run our own data center better than a cloud provider is, I think, ludicrous.
Well, and the other thing I would say to both of that is, let's see, so your on-premise data center is connected to the internet and the cloud is connected to the internet. They have the same inherent vulnerabilities. What you really want is the many eyes approach, and that's what you get with an enterprise cloud solution, because I don't know of any commercial cloud company whose business model is selling their services that is not going to try and get as many people and the best people as possible to look at making sure that service is secure.
David, one of the challenges that when you were modernizing your IT infrastructure, the FCC's IT infrastructure, was a lot of these systems, as you mentioned, were quite old, and it was just hard to get people to maintain them. That being said, you also had a lot of people who these were basically their babies. They had given birth to them, they had taken care of them. And all of a sudden they felt a real fear that, oh my goodness, I may not have a job when these things are gone. How did you deal with that process? Because it just feels so hard.
It is, and I think you have to recognize that people don't like to change. That's an inherent human feature that, for the most part, we don't like to change when things are going well, or even if they're going semi-well. And doing something different can create emotions of fear, worry, and stress. And so when you are serving as a digital diplomat and human flak jacket to an organization and trying to change it, you need to acknowledge that there is going to be stress and frustration and fear. And yes, in some cases, because we are going to 100% public cloud and commercial service, we will not need the same number of contractors that we used to have on premise. In fact, we did see a reduction, and we continue to. And that in some respects, those have been people that have been at the FCC. The contractors on average have been at the FCC for 19 and a half years. The average government employee had been at the FCC for 15 years. And so you are breaking up relationships of people that have known each other on average for about 15 years, and you just showed up and you're asking people to trust you. And so that gets to the issue of trust. And interestingly enough, trust occurs when someone perceives that the other party is benevolent, competent, and operates with integrity. And I think that is so key, and that is why it takes time to get some small wins in first, involve the team, don't be top-down. If you try to be top-down, then it's sort of management by fiat, and they will not have your back when something goes wrong. It really has to be listen to them, acknowledge that you're going to personally have blind spots as a C-suite leader. And in fact, I love to point out there's a Harvard article that says in praise of incomplete leaders that the best leaders point out that they don't have all the answers, and they actually reward people that point out the blind spots. And what you're really trying to do is, over a period of time, when I first arrived, I polled the team, and I think only about 15% were excited about the future. 45% were on the fence, and the remainder actually were honest. They said they wanted to go back to the way things were in the 1990s. And I was like, well, how can we move forward together from that? And in fact, one person said they had a beef, and I said, well, tell me a little bit more. I was doing Socratic methods, so I could only ask questions. I couldn't give my view. And that person said, well, it happened 17 years ago. And I was like, tell me more. And it was basically something that happened where there had been more contractors versus government from that point on. And I said, we are all one team, one family. There are no cliques. But how can we all move forward together from this? And sort of, again, engage in creative problem solving where you're involving the entire team in solving it as opposed to just you. And then over a period of the next 4 months when I polled again, it had gone from 15% to about 30%. Another 4 months had gone from 30% to 45%, and we hit the tipping point at about the 1 year mark. And about a year and a half in, before we went to 100% public cloud and commercial service provider, we now had about 85% on board. But that only happens when you walk the walk, that you are willing to be vulnerable, that you are willing to hear from the team changes in direction and actually hear the narratives and the battle scars. And you really have to earn trust. And that's why I say organizational empathy is so key for any C-suite leader, but particularly if you're trying to do modernization and transformation. You need to do whatever you can to try and reduce the stress, reduce the fear, give autonomy to your team members, protect their backs. When things go right, all success goes to them. When things go wrong, you've got to take the hit and be the flak jacket. That's ultimately how you move the organization forward.
Again, CIO job sounds really, really fun.
And no IPO in public service, so sign up now.
Yeah, exactly. Talk about making government cool again. Chad, did you want to add anything? I heard you.
I'd say I couldn't agree more on the vulnerability piece. If a leader can show that they are not perfect, and admitting that every time I've admitted that I was wrong, or I changed direction because somebody pointed out something that made more sense, our credibility goes up. We actually have a little bit of ceremony we do with the management team, and we're probably going to extend it down to the rest of the staff. We call it the airing of the grievances, right? So it's this idea that we have created a space where, and so far it's been all the other grievances on me, so I think we might have found the problem. But the idea that I'm willing to listen to how my actions may have inhibited our ability to drive forward. And the thing that makes that even better is the other thing we've championed is the idea that we assume positive intent. And we started with the leadership team, and we're driving it down to the entire staff, including contract team. It's like, assume that if somebody doesn't call you back, there's something going on in their life that may be preventing them, that they're not snubbing you. Or if somebody says something that appears confrontational or mean, assume that there's a positive intent and that everybody's trying to drive the mission forward. You make that change, and all of a sudden people tend to believe that, and they start asking questions. And you start asking questions, and you start to get curious, and you start to learn, and all of a sudden the team starts to move forward with no management involvement at all.
Yeah, they have to feel safe in some way, shape, or form. David, I always say that people love change as long as we can keep doing things the same way we always have. And that, of course, defeats the purpose of. But unfortunately, we're out of time. As I predicted, it would all go very quickly. So I'm going to close out with actually a question that was submitted by Nikki. And she says, what can I do as a government employee to expedite the process from legacy to a more modern system? I think, Lisa, sometimes people feel like this is just way above their pay grade. There's nothing I can do. Is there anything that just Joe or Joanna Fed can do to help this modernization process along?
I definitely think, as, kind of get engaged. I think that most IT leaders that we're seeing now are of the the skill set of both Chad and David, where they are listening, they are taking into account stakeholder feedback. So give your feedback, give your recommendations as to what you are seeing at your level when these opportunities arise, and do your job well and take the initiative, continuously. But make your voice be heard during these sessions that my peers here brought up. That's my biggest piece of advice.
Chad, what can folks do to help this process along?
Don't accept no as an answer. Right? No is the beginning of the conversation, and if you're given an opportunity to ask a question, use it. I hate to be in sessions where you ask questions or you find a way and all of a sudden you hear crickets and they're chirping back there. Right. Ask a question, even if it sounds stupid to you, it might just be the one thing that engages the conversation, or maybe it gets your neighbor encouraged to ask their question. All of a sudden the combination breeds something that none of us were thinking about before.
That never happens in any session that I'm moderating, by the way. But I agree, it drives me crazy. David, wrap it all up for us.
So I think to build on both what Lisa and Chad said, all of that and recognize the need for creative problem solvers at all parts of the organization and across organizations has never been higher. I mean, the rate our world is changing is so fast and accelerating that no one person can be a creative problem by themselves. We can't leave that to the C-suite. We can't leave that to the IT management. It really has to be creative problem solvers at all levels, and so that does involve asking questions, seeing where you can add value, and ultimately teeing up for both your team as well as for your supervisor, tee up options and say, look, I've looked into this. I think this is an issue. Here's why. Here are 2 or 3 different paths. If you give me your backing, I think these are the outcomes we can get, and that makes it very easy for people to say yes, and that to say, I've got your back, run with it. Let's check back in 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now. Let me know in the interim if you need me to take additional hits or be that flak jacket so you can show what you can do. But it really is recognizing that we need creative problem solvers at all levels across public service if we're going to both modernize and, even more importantly, transform how we deliver results.
Awesome. This is GovLoop's Dorobek Insider Live, brought to you today by MuleSoft, Citrix, DLT, Red Hat, SolarWinds, and Tintri. I want to thank David Bray, Chief Information Officer at the FCC, Lisa Schlosser. She is the former Deputy CIO and of Fed 100. Congratulations on that, by the way, Lisa. Great honor and well-deserved. Chad Sheridan, CIO at the Agriculture Department's Risk Management Agency. And earlier, we heard from GovLoop's Francesca Elatrish about the GovLoop guide. Just a few reminders. We'll have a write-up taken from this discussion on GovLoop's Dorobek Insider, probably tomorrow, I would guess, but I'll let out to you. And we will email the on-demand version of this program, so you'll have it. And a plug for next month's session. Next month, we're talking about health IT. The producer of GovLoop's Dorobek Insider Live are Emily Jarvis and Steph Driscoll and Megan Price. And yes, they are the magicians that make all this work. Thank you, ladies. I'm Christopher Dorobek. Thanks for being here. Go out, do good work. Thanks, David, Lisa, and Chad, and we'll talk to you soon.